Hello, this is Gabe Matthews for Pt.5. We're continuing on with our Intro to Rendering series. In today's video, we're going to discuss materials. Materials indicate four basic properties of information about objects that are in the scene. They are diffuse, emit, reflect, and refract. Most programs extrapolate additional properties from these four main categories and make them even more customizable. For instance, the emit channel can be separated out into luminance and glow, which gives you further control over every aspect. But for this video, we're going to keep it simple. We're going to keep it to the four main categories. Before we get into the individual properties, though, let's take a moment and think about a blue plastic chair. What we can take away from the idea of a blue plastic chair when speaking about the materials is this. A, it's blue. This means that the surface is accepting all photons that are every wavelength except those which are a particular shade of blue that we are looking at. These photons bounce off the surface and come back to our eye, or in the instance of a rendering, the camera, and we read the surface as blue. B, it's plastic. This means that along with the photons that are reading blue, the surface doesn't scatter light like something that is softer like carpet, leather, or paper. So it reflects back focused sections of light depending on the viewing angle, and this gives us a hot spot of white light. This hot spot is known as the specular reflection. Not all plastics give off a specular reflection though, of course, but for this example, we're going to assume it does. C, because most chairs aren't clear, light isn't usually going to pass through the thicker spots of plastic to be visible on the other side, so we can make an assumption that we don't need to worry about how the light will cast on the opposite side of a material. D, along with not being clear, most chairs aren't illuminated, meaning they don't emit light like a light bulb, so we don't need to worry about making the chair illuminate. Now, I know some of my more snarky audience members are going to rush to make it a clear glowing chair, but bear with me for this example. E, the chair might have some bumpiness due to the plastic casting texture or a simulated wood grain, but we're going to assume that the chair won't need to be viewed from a super close view, so we can forego this for now. What we've just done is broken down the material properties of the chair. This is what I like to call creating the material recipe. The easiest metaphor I can think of is to think about your material as a stack of acetate layers. Each layer defines a particular property, and you can add additional layers to control the transparency and amplitude of each. Now, let's explore the properties in a little more depth. The diffuse channel is the most basic channel to apply to your object. It defines the colors that are going to bounce back from the surface to the camera. In our chair example, this was our blue color. By using mapping channels, you can further control what colors go where on the model. I'll discuss this technique in part 7 of this Intro to Rendering series. The emit channel controls the illumination qualities of your object. This is a great channel to use when working with light bulbs, little LED lights, or adding illumination to an object where you feel it's appropriate. The reflect channel might sound the most familiar to you. The reflect property defines how much light and what kind of light is rejected by the surface back to the camera and the environment, creating highlights and soft reflections on the ground. By adding a Fresnel reflection to your surface, you can get better quality reflections and thereby create a little more realism in your render. I tend to give almost every material I render a reflection channel, so I can add just a bit of sheen to my softer plastic parts or higher intensity reflections to mirrors, glass, polished concrete floors, and so on. In our chair example, I would put a medium to high gloss reflection channel into place to control the specular highlights that I referred to earlier. The refraction channel is a cousin of reflection. Unlike reflection, the refraction deals with how much light actually passes through the surface and then manipulates the position, color, and shadows, etc. on the way out the other side. Depending on how you set the channel up, it'll probably bog down your rendering time the most as it has a lot of calculations involved. Renderings that you've seen that involve highly realistic skin, wax, diamonds, clear plastic, etc. all employ the refraction channel. On top of these four categories, additional surface and texture information can be applied to aid in adding additional information to the scene. Bump maps, displacement maps, alpha maps, and all sorts of other visual indicators. Bump maps are usually grayscale images that indicate certain levels of simulated height and displacement of a surface. The important key word here is simulated. It actually doesn't displace your surface so much as it uses the grayscale information to create highlights depending on if it's more white, you'll have a higher degree of highlight, and if it's more black, it'll look more like it's debossed into the surface. This is really useful if you don't have time or horsepower to actually model out your surface and you want to save some resources for keeping your renders fast. If you've ever played a video game in the last 5 years and you see shiny surfaces that look bumpy, this is active bump mapping. It allows for fantastic visual results without having to build out geometry. The only downside is it's simulated. So if you want to actually extract geometry, you're better off displacing the surface and extracting the mesh. With displacement maps, as I've covered in the displacement video on the site, you're indicating actual levels of height and displacement of a surface. which in this case, you're telling the mesh to actually change its geometry. This is a little more effective in creating geometry that pops off your surface of your model. However, it can start to slow your renderings depending on your individual settings. Alpha maps are usually used to give transparent effects to a texture. Say you want to have a logo decal that wraps around a cylinder. The logo file would be applied to the cylinder, but then in a render, you'd see a white background of the file. You would create a duplicate of the file, and this would be your alpha map. And the alpha map version of the file would contain a solid black and white image to correct this out by masking out the parts of the logo you see and those which you don't. It's really handy. These additional information channels can all be controlled independently of each other. The subject of materials is deep and broad, and if you have any additional questions on this topic, I urge you to post some questions in the comments section below or email me at pilot@polyplane.com, and I'll do my best to answer your questions because I know that this can be a little tricky and a little overwhelming. Below this video are some links for learning about and building out materials, so be sure to check them out. And there's some that are very specific to V-Ray and some that are specific to KeyShot, but don't let that inhibit you from just checking it out and learning, because the material section is where it's at. Like, you're very rarely going to render out a model that doesn't have any sort of material information to this is one of those critical things you need to learn about when creating your model. So the first two links down there, CG Textures and Texture Pilot, those sites are just awash with hundreds of free textures for you to download and give you some handy reference information for when you're building out textures. There's another link down there to Matt Kor's site called Control Paint, and I recommend you buy his Creating Realistic Surfaces video from his store page. Unbelievably useful information on that video that'll really start getting you to think about how materials kind of function, and just look around your desk at different things and how they finish and try to make your own material recipes. Maybe you have, you look at your mouse and what parts of it are glossy and what parts of it are matte, and are there different colors that are used, and how do those colors affect one another, and how do the highlights cast across? So those are all questions you should be asking yourself as you're building out your materials. The next video in the Intro to Rendering series, we're going to be talking about the camera, so make sure you stay tuned for that and stick around, because we're going to be wrapping this series up rather quickly and start talking about our scene and bringing it all together. So thanks so much for watching and have a great day.